Hi, this is Jason, and I'm back with another basics painting tutorial. Today I'm going to paint this Minotaur Centaur that I scratch built. I thought that would be a cool thing to show. I cut up two different bones models and put a little green stuff in there and found some pieces out of some bits bags and created this thing. I think it's pretty cool. So you'll see there's some 40K pieces, some fantasy pieces. That top part's from an actual Minotaur. The bottom part of the bones model, I believe, is from a unicorn. And then the rest is some pretty cool pieces that I found in bits bags that I got off eBay, I think. So anyway, because I'm painting a bones model, and bones models are kind of an interesting material, they don't primer well. They become really sticky. So instead of using a regular primer, you can just paint on a layer of paint. And I like to use something that's similar to what I would use as a primer. Either use this ivory or maybe just a plain white, but you can obviously choose whatever color you like. And you will see that the paint goes on in a little bit different consistency than maybe you're used to. So I'm going to pick out a fairly large brush, just one that I don't need to do any detail. I'm just covering this model with this ivory paint. And sometimes it might take a couple layers, and it doesn't have to look perfect. Remember, you're just doing this in order to get other paint to stick to this layer of paint. I find that with a bones model, that the paint kind of wants to go together. I don't know, it probably doesn't exactly make sense, but it wants to kind of form together, so it makes it really hard to paint fine details on it. Although you can do it. You don't actually need to get this layer of base paint on there like primer. You can just go for it and paint it. I still suggest washing it first. I've talked about that in previous videos. The importance of washing your models. I think that makes a big difference with a bones model. I have had a couple where I'm convinced there is some mold release on them, because the paint really doesn't want to stick. But, you know, that's up to you. Okay, so I'm going to work on this for a little bit, and then I'll come back when I'm done and it's had a chance to dry. Here's my model. I've given it that coat of ivory, and something to know is this is a trick you can do anytime you don't have spray primer or paint on primer, is to just give a model a coat of an undercoat of something you like. Ivory means a lot of colors are going to shine nicely on it, even if I use some lighter colors. I did have to touch up some spots, like I said, with the bones models, which I've heard some people don't like to paint them at all because they're sort of difficult to deal with. But if you use this undercoat trick, they're honestly pretty much just like working with any other model, and they're really cost effective. You know, they're cheap, they're good value, they're indestructible, and they have a wide variety of choices. So next is, what color do I paint the horse body? I'm going to stick with the same color for the centaur body parts, skin parts, and I really like this Reaper paint called Dark Skin. So I'm going to get my dish, get a little of that. It's a really good color because it's a flesh tone. It has a tiny bit of shine in it. It's like a little bit nicer than just using a similar tone if it were just maybe a brown or something, which you could use. But this has a really nice color. So, you know, I know this is the first layer or first color I'm putting on, so I got a pretty big brush. I just want to coat this model. I know that I'm going to have to touch it up, you know, my two thin coats. this is going to look really great. So I'm going to work on that for a few minutes, and then I'll be back. Here's my model with one coat of that dark skin in all the parts I want to be dark for the Centaur and the Minotaur parts. One of the cool things about Centaurs or horse bodies is you have a really wide variety of colors that can all look good, switching it up. I like this color, and I think it contrasts nicely with the yellow that I'm going to paint the tail and the fur or hair around the hooves and the hair on the back of the Centaur's neck. So it works for me, but don't be afraid to experiment. The other cool thing is, horses tend to have all kinds of different patterns on their bodies. You can really go crazy mixing and matching different colors, and it'll all look good. I'm also going to go over this brown with a flesh wash later, but the thing I want you to see is just the magic of two coats. So right now there's just one coat on there, and you can see it's patchy. It looks like crap still. But when you put a second coat on there, it's really going to look a lot better. And I think that's one of the big difference makers between someone who is just learning to paint, and you look at their models and you can tell they just did one coat or kind of globbed on paint too thick. Don't be afraid to use thinner paint and do multiple coats. A lot of times that's going to help you retain as much detail as possible, especially on a model like this where I put that base coat of paint. Every layer of paint you lose a little detail, so it's always got to be worth it. You got to economize your layers of paint. Check this out. Now he has another coat, thin coat of that brown, same color, and it's had a chance to mostly dry, still getting there. And you can see how much more even it looks, how much better it looks. And that's just step one, but it kind of gives you a sense of what you got to do to get each level of your paint job looking at the best you can. And each step only takes 2-3 extra minutes, but it can make a big difference in the long run. The other thing I want to mention is when you're doing some of this kit bashing stuff, it means you're going to end up with some nooks and crannies, little parts of the model that you're not exactly sure how to paint them. Maybe you can see on this particular model I've given him a belt, some different items, and a lot of that is to cover up the fact that I just can't sculpt that well with green stuff, at least not efficiently. So I put that belt on to kind of cover up some of my mistakes. You can be crafty that way. Anyway, the next thing I'm going to do is paint some yellow. And the yellow I'm going to use is this Games Workshop Flash Glitz Yellow, Flash Gits. And I'm going to use that on all the furry parts, like the tail, the fur around the hooves, and the mane on the Minotaur part. So after I've had a chance to work on that, I'll keep you updated. I have added yellow to all the fur parts. That's the tail, the mane, and around the hooves. It's still a base coat. You can see it looks pretty basic. Next I'm going to do the armor plating, and I have a blue color I like to use. But just on the subject of hair and fur, I really like to do hair and fur because you have so many options, and they pretty much, a lot of different things can look good. I'm planning on putting some kind of wash and then doing a dry brush over the top of that. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So right now I'm just looking to get a lot of contrast between the skin of the horse, or the fur of the horse, and the skin of the Minotaur, and the color of the fur. So talking about shifting gears to the armor plating, I know a lot of times I like to do a bolt gun metal type of color. I use a different one, kind of this gunmetal gray. Oftentimes I will use that on the gun for this guy, but for the armor I'm gonna switch it up and use another color I really like called gunmetal blue, which is a fantastic color also from Reaper. And I'm gonna be putting that over the top of another blue color, probably this one, heather blue. But there's a lot of different options for that. If you have some blues you like or a different color you like, a lot of times getting the metallic version of that color and going over the top of that can look really good. This gunmetal blue on its own doesn't give great coverage, which is actually a positive feature of the paint because you can put it over a lot of other colors. So it looks really good over pretty much any blue you put it over, this like a heather blue like this, or if you put it over the surf aqua, this kind of lighter blue color, or maybe even this deep twilight blue, which I use sometimes more like a wash. Water it down, use it like a wash. So you got different options. I like to get a lot of different options in the same color, and those are a lot of the blues that I use. You can mix and match them in a variety of ways, and that's one of the fun parts of this hobby, is experimenting with stuff like that. I do the same thing with the purples. I like to use this metallic purple pearl sometimes and mix that over like some contrast Magos purple, and then I have my other purples, Passion, and this one is just grape purple or GP purple. I think that's grape. So you know, try to get maybe 3-4 of the same like kind of family of paints and see what you can do with them. That's a really cool thing to make your army stand out to you. Oh, check this out. One of my newest purchases, I got a bottle of deep violet purple artist's ink to mess around with. That's one of my upcoming projects. Little side note there. Okay, so I'm going to work on painting the armor plating heather blue and see how that goes. I've applied one layer of the heather blue, and it is a thin paint, and I needed to shake it up a little more. And I've also noticed a few spots that I've missed with my brown dark skin color. So a couple things I'm going to do next are put another layer of that blue, and I'm also going to touch up the brown. One nice thing about the Citadel paints, like the Citadel yellow that I used, is it does give really great coverage. And despite how much people might complain about Citadel paints, coverage is usually not one of them. Yellow, a light color like that, if you buy a one of these more standard yellows you can find at a craft store, it is not going to give coverage like that in one coat. So yellow is one where I think you really get what you pay for from the Citadel paints. So yeah, like I said, I'm going to touch up the brown dark skin, and I'm going to put a second layer of the heather blue on the armor plating, and we'll take it from there. Check them out. We got a couple thin coats of the heather blue on there. Next, I'm going to do some metallics. So what I've decided is I'm going to paint the gun this gunmetal gray that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to paint a few pieces around his belt metallic. I'm primarily going to be using this color, Worn Penny. I'm really thinking about that big skull thing right in front. Maybe the handle of that knife. And maybe part of that feathery thing The rest, oh, definitely that grenade under there. The rest of the belt is going to be painted sort of a leather color. I'm going to use another one of my favorite colors. This one right here, oiled leather. Fantastic color made by Reaper. Okay, I'm going to work on that next. Had a chance to apply some metallics. So you got the handle of the knife. I decided to go with the canteen. Paint that the gunmetal color. I got the gun. Just making it gunmetal. Remember, this is just a base coat. And I painted the skull and I painted these rings on this mace thing. With metallics, just like other paints, it's important to remember you can do that second coat. And these paints don't give me the best coverage, but I wanted you to see what it looks like with just one coat. Now, when I first started painting, I used to think, wow, that's disappointing. I want better coverage than that. But in actuality, there are times when I want a paint that is going to give a little less coverage. So it's a useful tool to have this paint. And I can always do that second coat and make it a little bolder. So take a look at that. I'm getting close to done with the base coats, but the model is really going to come together when we start doing the washes and a little bit of dry brushing. And I think that's a really cool point to make too. Sometimes when you get to this point in the model, you start to think, wow, it looks pretty good. Like I've bought models that came in a package, like a package of Dungeons and Dragons minis, or maybe HeroClix or something, cheaper models, and thought, you know, they're painted about this good. But that's not as good as you can make it look with it just going a little bit the extra mile. So that's what I hope you get out of this video, is see how important each step of the modeling is, but also that you can make great looking models and you don't have to be a genius, amazing, incredible, fine motor dexterity type of individual to make it happen, because just a little practice and a few tricks will make it all worthwhile. I've finished with some of the leather bits. Oh, darn, I see a spot I missed right here between his two pieces of armor. I'm going to paint that leather, but I'll get that in a minute. For now, I want to go back over some of the metallic parts. So I'm going to get out my gunmetal, start going back over this gun, giving it a second layer. Just kind of smooths out everything. You may have noticed that I didn't bother to prime this gun or the weapon in the other hand, and this is going to sound a little contradictory. I can think of many a time I've sat and talked about all the reasons to prime or something. But when I was scratch building or kit bashing or whatever you want to call it, this model, I wasn't thinking about primer, and couldn't primer this model once I had, I couldn't spray primer it once I'd used a Bones model. So I just decided not to primer this, and it was bringing me back to some of my early days of painting when I was pretty young, but I was also a little bit afraid of using spray paint, and I was resistant to it. So I painted lots of models and didn't have primer. And you know what? They still look okay today, and it's been 30 years or more. So, you know, it's going to be fine. I also have a nice spray fix-it. If I can spray on him when I'm done, he's going to look just fine. So anyway, there's the gun. 2 coats of paint. I also want to get a little extra paint on the canteen that I made this same color. And yeah, that's it on that color. Clean my brush. feel like I should show you the size of the brush I'm using. It's not the smallest brush, but not the biggest brush. This is a brush I've had a long time. I've used it a lot. I do have some smaller brushes I'll use for some finer details, but right now I really want to get the paint on. The other part I painted the leather color is this little handle piece, this weapon. I'm still undecided on what to paint the bulk of the weapon. I'm thinking I will use a brown color called Spice Brown, or as I like to call it, Spicy Brown. Okay, Warren Penny. Let's get down to it. So the main piece is that big skull. So you can real quickly see what that second layer does. Just gives it a lot more depth. Also saw a spot on this side where I got a little silver on there. Didn't mean to. It's always okay to touch up your models. You're not going to be perfect doing this stuff. So just go back and touch them up. Usually takes just a second or two. All right, good on that. The other parts that are bronze, I decided don't need anymore. No one's going to notice. Going to leave it at that. The next thing I want to do is paint some of the horns and the hooves. And I have a color I really like to use for that kind of thing. It's another Reaper paint. Fantastic color. Here I am shaking my paints. Importance of shaking your paint. It's called Aged Bone. This is a great off-white color. I always think it's funny how I kind of get into using different paints. Okay. Last time I did one of these, I feel like I was using almost all Citadel paints, and then this one I'm using almost all Reaper paints. I just kind of go back and forth, whatever I'm feeling. So this is going to be his horns. See, how long did that take? Not long. Takes a little bit of patience. But usually if you slow it down, you can get pretty good at getting it right the first time. It's going to look real good when I put some wash on it. Also, he's got this weird claw thing on the back of his gun, making him look a little wastelandy. Gonna make that like it's a real piece of bone too, like maybe he took this claw off some other creature, stuck it on the back of his gun. Being the old savage Minotaur Centaur that he is. I also want to paint these hooves this color. Could have gone whiter with these, but I think they're going to look fine. Painting has been a great way for me to sort of focus on something during this stay-at-home order here. Especially with working from home, I've had a lot more screen time than I'm used to being on my computer for work, which is okay. Glad to have the technology. So feeling fortunate in some ways, but it's also quite a grind to sit on a computer for hours on end when it's not normally been part of your routine. So I've been painting instead of watching TV or playing video games or other things I might do on my phone. There we go. Okay, so another little trick. So I have a little bit of this bleach bone, this bone color left in front of me, aged bone. And I have a few other models here. I'm going to try to just use up the bone color on these other models sitting aside, and then I'll be back. Next, I'm going to paint some spice brown onto this mace weapon that he's holding. This spice brown is a nice versatile brown, and maybe you can tell I really like brown. It's one of those colors that has a lot of uses. Then after I'm painting this part brown, make it look maybe like he uprooted a tree or something, I'm going to paint these other pieces gray around there, so that maybe he bolted some stone to a tree trunk or something. I don't know, it's altogether pretty ridiculous. But he is a Minotaur Centaur, so we can't really get more ridiculous than that. If you take an interest to weird centaurs, I actually made a codex to use them in 40K. It's sort of in a rough draft form, but you can find it on the Facebook 40K Fandex site. If you become a member there, there's a lot of other really cool stuff people have made. Probably people that are more experienced at the game than me, but I sure like painting, so there you go. Okay, that's enough brown there. Oh, maybe I'll just, since I got some brown right here, get that strap. There you go. Okay, so next I want to do his eyes. Before I do a wash on any of the head, I want to make sure I get the eyes in there, because the wash will look nice when I go around the eyes. And I'm going to do the gray right there on that. And for the gray, I'm going to be using another one of these pretty common craft paints. It is, let's see, I'm going to be using this one. It's called Rain Gray. And I find that it's very similar to the Mechanicus gray that you can get, made by Games Workshop. Gray is one of those colors where I don't think it honestly matters what brand you buy. Get one that you like. You might be thinking, well, this is already a gray piece. Why paint it gray? It'll look better. That's why. Just painting it looks better, even if it's the same color you're already working with. Okay, check out the weapon. There it goes. So when I put a wash on that thing, it's going to look super tough. So all I have left to do now before I start the washes is that little item right there. And I'm going to leave that as a surprise for you because I really don't know what I'm going to do with it yet. But for the eyes, I'm going to make them just plain white. And all I'm going to do is focus on getting a small brush and painting that whole eye area. There was a time when I'd get into painting pupils and that whole deal, which, you know, if you want to practice and do it, it can look awesome. But honestly, I think for this model, just painting it white in there so you see where the eyes are, and then hitting that with the flesh wash, I think is going to look pretty good. But if I change my mind, maybe I'll add pupils later. We'll see. Okay, let's check in. Checking out the eyes. You can see I just basically put a couple white dots there, and I used a real basic white paint called Blanco. Couple dots there. I think they'll look pretty good. Next, for the little sash, I painted the top part gold, and I used this whatever this brand is, metallic 14 karat gold Serum Coat Delta Creative. This paint has a little different consistency. The metallics sometimes do. It's a real gooey, gummy. It's a pain to work with. I've tried watering it down, then I get no coverage with it. It's a difficult paint to work with. That's just something to know. Metallics are kind of finicky. For the feathers, I have decided to go with another shade of blue. I was talking earlier about how it's great to have lots of shades in the same kind of color. So for this guy, since I'm using all this blue, maybe he found these feathers on some creature and thought, wow, they kind of go with me. So I'm using this contrast Aethermatic Blue Citadel paint. It's a really fun color. You can see I started painting the feather, and then I thought, you know what? I'm going to record this. So just so you can see how the contrast paint goes on. I did have to touch up the feathers with the pearl color I used earlier because I got some brown on there, and the contrast paint would not be able to mask that brown. I had to touch it up. The other thing I can do is I can let this dry, put on another layer, a little more contrast paint. I really like the contrast paints for certain jobs. They can just add something. I'm hoping this is one of those situations. So make it a little thicker here at the top. Get in those grooves. Alrighty, let's see how that looks when it dries. Nice thing about the contrast paint is it really grips the model nicely. I think that it looks really good when just to use on a small piece like that, small part of the model. all by itself. It adds something. Taking a look at where that blue dried, those feathers, it looks pretty good, but not perfect. So I'm going to add a little more of that just to touch it up and fill out some of the spots where it dried a little unevenly. Which I've noticed can happen sometimes with the contrast paints. Like everything else, you just gotta give a little bit of a second coat. Nice. So I'm gonna let that dry for a few minutes. Then I'm gonna paint another contrast paint on there, and that's gonna go on all those yellow parts that I had painted earlier. And I'm gonna use this one, Griffhound Orange. And that's gonna make the fur and the mane look really good. And after that, I add that orange. I'm thinking of doing a little bit of dry brushing on those areas using this color, Golden Blonde. So I'm going to let that dry for a few minutes. I'm going to start applying this contrast Griffhound Orange to the yellow parts, the mane, fur around the hooves, the tail. And we're going to see how it looks here. Yeah. You kind of get a sense of what that contrast paint can do to a color underneath it, like yellow. And like everything else, this might take some touch-ups after this initial coat. But it's going to really make that pop nicely. So I'm going to keep working on that. And I will return when I've painted all of those yellow parts. Okay, taking a look at how that orange contrast paint dried on there, it looks pretty cool. Probably could just leave it at that, but I really want to try brushing on some of this Golden Blonde color by Reaper. So I'm going to shake that up real good. I haven't used it in a while. And get an old brush and try to see what I can do with it. Just going to try a little bit, you know. Honestly, if I don't like it, I could just paint that contrast paint right over it and probably no one would notice. I think that's sometimes what you got to do is just be willing to take a few chances here. Although I'm pretty sure it's going to look awesome, so I'm not worried about it. Okay, for this dry brushing, I'm gonna fully saturate this brush with some of this blonde paint. And then I'm going to take it over here and just wipe it like crazy. All right, maybe that's good enough. And then I'm just going to use some even strokes and see what I get here. Just trying to capture the edges a little bit. Make it a little blonde. Maybe this will make it look a little more like hair, less like plastic. The Reaper paints really have a thinner consistency. They can be really great for something like this. I think the important thing is to just take your time. You will get faster as you practice these kinds of things. Okay, so we can see where I brushed on some blonde, like looking at this area compared to just the straight contrast down here. And you can decide for yourself if you would just leave it as is with the contrast or if it's worth it to do a dry brush. But you know, I've got this dry brush going on, so now I'm gonna finish it up. Got some added texture there on the hooves. Dry brushing is kind of like adding spice or salt to your food. You know, it's easy to add and hard to take away. So it's usually good to start with less and kind of build up to the amount that you want on your model. And also sometimes when you're wiping your brush clean, you think, wow, there can't be any paint left on there, but there is, and there's enough to dry brush. So always just a couple things to keep in mind. Something I meant to mention before, a little side note, is that sometimes it's nice to have multiple projects going at once. So I'm painting a couple other models right now. This is some old school miniatures brand, sci-fi dwarves, my first passion, sci-fi dwarves. And since I have a little bit of blonde paint left, I'm going to use it just to paint some beards here. And since the blonde is left in my dish, and that's something I like to do. I've heard some people say that they like to just work on one project at a time, and you know, you just have to plan accordingly. I do have more of these Minotaur Centaurs to paint, but I've kind of decided just to do one for this video, so I've been actually painting it over the course of a couple days. And in the meantime, while paint's drying, or if I have a little something extra, I find a detail on one of these little sci-fi dwarves to use up the paint on. So that guy's going to have a little blonde beard. Trying to see if I have another beard I can paint, but I don't. So maybe that's good enough. Clean my brush. Next thing I want to do is work on some of this armor chest plate for this guy, Minotaur Centaur. And for that, I'm going to be using gunmetal blue. It's the first part, and I'm contemplating adding something over the top of that. Let me get there. So this, shake it up real good. This gunmetal blue is a great color. It's very dark. It's thin in texture, and it allows some color to show through beneath. So here, let's see how it looks. If you can see that, it's going to add a metallic tint to this armor plating, and in my opinion, it adds kind of a sci-fi edge to them. This Minotaur model really was a fantasy model, and you know, a lot of sci-fi models have a bit of a fantasy look, so in fact, sci-fi can kind of encompass any style, and it's, I guess, another conversation, but sometimes your paint job can really help you to define the model in the way you want. And I want this guy to look like his armor is a little more modern, or maybe a little more like power armor, opposed to just plates of metal. So painting it blue, painting it metallic. Maybe you'll see when it dries, it won't be quite so shiny. Finish it up, but things like that can really make it look the way you want it to. Let's take a look. The model's starting to come together. Here's the blue. After it's got that metallic sheen on it, I am going to next apply some Nuln Oil. So I'm going to do that to all the metallic bits. And basically, it's going to be his armor plating, the gun, and that metal shield thing in the front, and his little gold brooch above the whatever's holding those feathers on. So put some Nuln Oil in my dish. Love this stuff. And get a big brush. Looking for the brush I want. All right. Okay, let's get the gun. So this is dark wash. I don't know what they do to Nuln Oil though, but it's definitely got something special in it, because it just works so great. And I've tried to make my own washes, and I've had friends do it, and they never work quite as well as the actual Nuln Oil. So I can say this is one where the Games Workshop product, at least from my experience, is the best. Doesn't mean you can't make your own dark wash if you need to, and it can still look great. I have certain things I want to use Nuln Oil on, and certain things where I'm like, you know what, it won't make much of a difference if I use my own wash. It's going to look fine, something small maybe. But for this, since I'm making a video and recording this, figure I might as well get out the good stuff. All right, that's going to look awesome when it dries. Okay, I also want to hit this handle for this knife. And the canteen. Keep finding little spots I want to touch up on the brown too, and I think that's part of paintings. You just see that stuff. Try to make a mental note. All right, let's see how this looks. Instantly picking out the details. Before I knew what Nuln Oil was, how it worked, I'd see someone, a model that was painted, and I think, wow, how did someone paint all those details? Must have taken forever. Little did I know, it's the wash trick. So Nuln Oil is going to make everything look greasy, which I don't know, if I have a fault as a painter, I'm always making things look darker. I like dark colors. Maybe it's because it's underneath the light. It's always bright, and I'm thinking, oh, it'll be fine when it's dark. But definitely, if I had to criticize myself, I would say my challenge is to use brighter colors more often. I'm trying to do that. But not today. Okay, let's get that grenade. And let's get that gold. Keep in mind that when it dries, it's not going to be quite so much. It won't look quite so oily once it dries. Since I got extra here in my dish, I'm just going to make the executive decision to also hit his mace with it. That's going to look pretty cool. The mace is something that probably just about any dark wash would look good on it, but Smolten oil will look good. The other one that a lot of people like is Agrax Earthshade, which makes things look kind of dusty, dirty. Could use that in this situation. I don't know. This is at hand, close at hand. Gets in all the cracks. It's also going to be able to sort of cover up some of the mistakes you made if you were off in some lines. A lot of times model painting is all about where the eye is drawn, and if it's just a little hole and you're like, what the heck's down in there, or I missed a spot down there, you can kind of paint it, make it dark in there, and it draws the person's eye away from the model in that one little place. So then, hey, no one notices your mistake. Yep. Well, that is pretty good, I think. A little weird spot on his hand. I may have to touch that up with some blue or some metal. I don't know yet. Yeah. Anyway, that's that. I'm going to let that dry for a minute. Next on the docket is to apply some flesh shade on the brown parts, on his body, his face, and all that stuff. So I gave this a good shake. It's just, I like to add the flesh because it flesh shade, it makes it a little shiny, which I think looks really good when it dries. Also seems to, give it some dimension. I was thinking about it. If I was going to do this over again, I think I would have used a lighter blue than that heather blue. So that'll be a decision I need to make going forward. I have like a surf aqua blue that I think might look better underneath that blue, gunmetal blue. But I also like this. I just think the armor came out a little darker than I would have liked. But I can live with it. Okay, there's that side. I really like this flesh shade. Reekland flesh shade. It's also interesting, I could see some parts I kind of missed that were up underneath that knife. But this flesh shade just covers them right up. So there's a spot of bronze that I accidentally put down. I'm going to have to touch that up. Get to that in a little bit. Yeah, I used to think I didn't really need flesh shades, like I could just use a little bit of brown tint or something. But nope, flesh shade is nice stuff. It's worth getting your hands on a bottle, finding one you like. I do love how that bronze skull there turned out. That thing looks really cool. So curious to see how his eyes will look. Kind of saving that for last here. It's funny too, I've seen people paint models and it's like they did a lot of base coat. They didn't do the fun part. Doing the washes and the dry brushing is like when the model starts to really come to life. And it's so easy to paint on. It's like the fun part. I was talking to a friend recently and talking about how if I was going to learn one more thing to do, it'd probably be edge highlighting. But he said, like edge highlighting has a really cool look, but it's not for him. And I was like, maybe that's all the excuse I need to never learn how to do it. But I probably should. All right. See how this face turns out. So I might want to put a little something in the nostrils. So you could probably just like add a little darkening in there. All right. Well, that is all the flesh shade. I'm going to let that dry for a little bit. show you the bottle of Flesh Shade. Rakelin Flesh Shade. Comes in a nice big bottle. Alright, see how that dries. Next, I want to apply this color called Contrast Skeleton Horde to the horns and to the hoof areas. This is a pretty fun color. It looks really good over white. See how it looks on these horns. In the past, I've used other really light washes, maybe like I mentioned, the Agrax Earthshade, or just some of the flesh wash. But if you got the perfect color, you might as well use it. So if you're doing a fantasy army or you have skeletons to paint, this is the perfect stuff. But it'll also pick out some nice details on these hooves. And I'm done with that. Set that aside. For the leather belt and some of these pockets and things like that, I'm going to give them a wash of this color, Contrast Agris Dunes. Probably could have used the Skeleton Horde for this job too. This color seems very similar to the Skeleton Horde to me, but it's a little bit more brown. Just realized I forgot to do this horn on this side of his gun. Here, just paint a little bit of Agros Dunes on there. Good enough. All right, there's the canteen. Take a look. Right there. Also had a chance, I did write down this particular gun is a Maxmini gun. It's made by a company named Maxmini, called the post-apocalyptic gun that they make. And it's a nice gun. It fits these 28mm models real well. Really helps make this guy look like he's from the wasteland somewhere. So I'm going to let that dry for a minute. But I mean, I'll do something with the base later. Maybe I'll just paint it black. Maybe I will put some rock or stones on it. I was talking about someday I'll do a video on doing some simple bases. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed seeing this guy get painted. You know, he's not perfect. I'm already thinking about some things I might do differently. Like I would definitely use that lighter blue, as I mentioned, on the armor so that the gunmetal blue and the oil, Nuln Oil, stood out a little more, but I think this looks pretty cool anyway. I think the gun looks great. I think the bronze skull looks great. The Nuln Oil on those two items looks good. I think his mace looks pretty tough, so that's good. I'm happy with the orange and yellow with the blonde on the hooves. I think it would have been good enough with just the contrast over the yellow. Or maybe I'd paint them blonde and then put the contrast yellow over it. And that's the other thing about these guys, or painting horses in general. If you do something different on the next one, it just adds variation. They don't all have to be matching, like if you're painting soldiers and all wearing the same uniform or something. I think his feathers there on his belt look really good. You know, his face, I think I'm happy enough with it. I think I could maybe paint the teeth. I may do that tomorrow or something. And put a little bit of the Agros Dunes wash on the white teeth. That would be cool. It's a small detail. But overall, I'm going to call this guy good. I think the wash, the Rakeland Flesh Shade over the dark skin wash made the muscles look pretty good on the back. That looks good. So overall, happy with him. But I hope you were able to see how you can take a little extra time with your base coats, maybe apply some washes, maybe try a dry brush, and maybe experiment a little bit and make your models look a lot better, like this guy on the battlefield. He's going to look pretty cool, or in your sci-fi RPG or whatever I decide to do with him. So there you go. Have a great day. One last thing, as I'm out here in my garage, I want to show you the Minwax Fast Drying Polyurethane Clear Satin. This is the product I'm going to spray my model with when I'm all done. And for some reason, this Minwax brand doesn't make a bones model sticky, and I'm not totally sure why. I'm sure there's some science behind that, but I learned that on a different video talking about how you can spray foam with this stuff. It's a great product. As always, spraying foam, spraying a bones model, I would suggest testing it ahead of time. Don't just take my word for it. I would hate for you to, just trust me and then buy just something that's a little off, or maybe they change the recipe a little bit and all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. I don't know. But so always test spray on a product on a little piece. But I've had great luck with this stuff. Okay, have a great night.